This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So it's fantastic to follow Steve. What he said, and now I'm going to say something. And I want to pick up on a couple of things that I've already heard today, because they're shot through what I'm going to read you, which is about something about the practice of spectating. One thing was coming in, sadly late, this morning and hearing about the appropriate balance of misunderstanding in comedy. I think that that's something I really want, I'm partly talking about, so I want to keep that in the air. Also, the idea that the translator feels the timing, which was so profound to me, just listening to it, also made me realize that a translator, or if I can just say a good translator, of theater, is a practicing spectator, right? Because one of the things you have to have done is to have had the experience of being surprised as a spectator to know then how to reproduce an experience of being surprised. So that for me was really important and continues to be important. And then a million other things, but what Steve was just talking about, which in a sense is kind of wonderful in the context that I'm now going to move. The body would be there, but I'm going to talk a lot about what you hear, is also the question of may recall. Because one of the things that this piece, there are two things this piece is doing, is continuing to think about what I am calling the practice of spectating carefully, because I hate when the Academy does things like, woo, spectator studies. I don't really want to think about it as a field. And I think it's interesting, the embodied spectatorship as a coinage, because actually I think people have been talking about embodied spectatorship in terms of talking about audience. But what became important for me in the new book is precisely two things. One is thinking about the spectating as a practice, but also thinking about what that practice pushes on, which is it's not just the practice of spectating, it's also how you tell each other about it. Right? And so one of my forms of telling each other about it is trying to figure out how to write about what I saw and what I heard. So this is in response to that notion in the air, thinking about translation, because the book is all about watching in theater in Europe, is about the Nature Theatre of Oklahoma's Romeo and Juliet. So, I'll begin. The inexplicable and the familiar reside together in the title of this touring production. The Nature Theatre of Oklahoma's Romeo and Juliet. The word Oklahoma sounds strange even to those of us born in the US. Mostly it conjures up a very long note, held to exaggerate the O in Oklahoma, that is the song of that name and the musical of that name by Ruthers and Hammerstein. Then nature with theater holding up the mirror, perhaps. But at least we know from Romeo and Juliet. And that is precisely what the actors and director want you to think. You know the play, you know the story, you know the tragedy. The set is a child's plaything, a proscenium much like something we might imagine erected in a late 19th century household to hold a tableau, to entertain a family, to host a group of children trying out a semi-public form of pretend. A platform, a curtain run across a pole attached to the back of the platform. However, one piece of verisimilitude confuses the interpretation. The protrusion of the back of what must be a prompter's box set deep in the floor. A prompter's box? In a collapsible, somewhat tacky, portable stage? It's portable, it's Romeo and Juliet. How much prompting do you need? Now, depending on one's knowledge of old movies by the master Ernst Lubitsch, that box might make you think of a very, very funny film. A film that is just on the cusp of a time when it could still be funny, before the truth of what was happening in Europe in 1939 came to light. In any event, the scene shows Jack Benny, who plays Hamlet, walking towards the front of the stage. In the ambidextrous perspective of the film camera, we, the viewers, the film audience, see the back of a ridiculously velvety, doubleted Benny, and beyond him the rows of lights, and beyond the rows of lights, audience members. In the prompter's box, a bespectacled, beret-toting little man. The men in prompter's boxes always seem to be little. Do remember this, because scale in the prompter's box is important in NTO's R&J. Looks at Benny, who strikes a Shakespearean pose, holding a small book close to his waist, looking out at the audience as the prompter whispers, to be or not to be. Of course, the hilarity is that this could be the line that Benny, or indeed any Hamlet would forget. And the hilarity continues when a very good-looking young soldier, played by Robert Stack, excuses himself, discombobulating an entire row of spectators in order to go backstage and meet the luminous comic heroine, Carol Lombard. If you haven't seen this movie, go home and rent it now. Okay. That digression, and we might talk about translation, time, digression, and comedy as a quartet worth thinking more about, serves to suggest how the incongruous prompter's box prompts more than the actor's memory. It prompts ours, the spectators. And NTO means it to prompt ours absolutely. Perhaps not in the way it did in mine in terms of a beloved old film, but the box works like a thing of memory at first. You notice it, it's odd. And then later you will watch it like a hawk. Forgive the proleptic joke, it will make sense anon. An actor enters. She is dressed in something that seems a cross between a nightgown and a 17th or 18th century costume. She looks at us, she starts speaking, so far so normal, as in, here we are in our seats in the practice that is expected, and here is the sole focus of our attention, the first actor to enter. Now, even if English were not your first language, even if you might, and this is just to remember that what I'm partly speculating on is the Berlin performance of this production. Now, even if English were not your first language, even if you might wonder where the two servants and their thumb-biting mishigosh opening is, or even if you expected something along the lines of two houses both alike in dignity, when you hear this actor and see her, you laugh. We are still at the cusp of the opening moments when this production could be very bad. Too pastiche, too casual, too taking the piss as she speaks. But you have to be a member of the audience made of stone. Now I'm thinking about the translation of stone, but anyway. But you have to be a member of the audience made of stone not to start grinning when she begins. Because she has a mobility in her face, a way of screwing up her cheeks to meet her nose. Meanwhile, her lips become independent creatures of scorn or dismissal or vulgarity or innuendo. Idly, I have to wonder what will happen to such forms of physical comedy initiated by the mobile face of a talented actor. It's a scientific fact that we don't move our faces as much as we used to. That these last generations of screen-fed society have no reason to articulate by expression what they are communicating, now apparently not even making little sounds since the muteness of texting and typing dominates daily not-utterance. So the actor, Anne Gridley, and her extraordinary ability to change the scenery of her visage at will strikes us as at once foreign and hysterical and exaggerated. Her fellow actor plays a complementary physical role to her face. Dressed indeed in Elizabeth, why did you write this word? Elizabethanish. That's why I wrote it. Black, stretchy rather than velvety, but still with those exposed legs and the crotch-defining tight fit. He holds his body actually upright, not unlike Jack Benny. Calls our attention to the seriousness of the endeavor by a formal posture. He is conventionally handsome, a contrast to the comically mobile and variable features of his partner in theatrical crime. I think it is he who first says the words, the R&J and the famous Balcone-knee scene. The audience tumble like toddlers on a wild ride, giggling all the way down, just because of the smallest twist of pronunciation. I am convinced there was a moment in rehearsal where the sonic miscue made for the tension that is the intriguing experience of watching, hearing, NTO trash and treasure Shakespeare, trash and treasure Romeo and Juliet. As the two actors trade off, speaking monologues, leaving the stage for the other to enter, they build a lackadaisical platform for meaning, while subtly building something else as well, a commentary on vagueness, on memory, on precision of language, a commentary on fear of theatricality, which is the prejudice against a theater made of difficult language or expressionist, non-realist playing that, in the UK and the US at least, means not only not funny, but pretentious, ridiculous, a penance to be endured. So, what happened in Berlin when he said Balcone? When she said morgue for morgue, I loved it. When she said poison for poison. These acoustic misprisions seem to work for spectators who are English speakers, like those little hammers the doctors use. Our knee, our Balcone, in fact, jerks. We laugh every time the mispronunciation is deployed. As Henri Bergson and Gary Larson, which maybe the first time they've ever been put together, as Henri Bergson and Gary Larson, creator of the Far Side cartoons, both know, Humor relies on a tiny space of hesitation, and I'll just remind those of you who don't know Far Side of the two deer and the one deer with the target on his stomach. And the caption is, bummer of a birthmark out. So part of what happens is that, or boneless chicken ranch, which you can imagine. And again, that hesitation between what you're saying and what you're reading. Okay, every time the mispronunciation is evoked, humor relies on a tiny space of hesitation within the run of time through a sentence. The sense as a spectator that you both know and don't know what you are looking at in the case of a Far Side cartoon. In the case of Bergson's marking of the beloved sonic pratfall that is mistaken pronunciation. But here's the thing. If English is not your first language, and believe me, as someone who has had to learn Italian late in life, I know, then mispronunciation is not a joke. It is either a dead stop of confusion and loss, or it is a new form of hilarity. Not a shared one, as with NTO's R&J, but a doubled up over the foreigner's unwitting witticism laughter by the master race, which is to say, the race whose first language it is. Then there is the pattern of language, probably more translatable across borders, because of the seemingly endless circulation via global television. Let's put aside the question of dubbing for a moment, and also let's remember that part of what I'm speculating on has to do with the fact that this is not a translation, that in fact you're hearing the words and potentially also seeing surtitles. Let's put aside the question of dubbing for a moment and consider the quasi-Tourette's, though not as charming, compulsion in US speak of the word like. Living abroad gives one ample time to chart the acoustic particularities of speech, especially if you live in Rome or any other European city playing host to lots of visiting students. So the national tics of speech come thick and fast on a bus, in a museum. That's like so not what I expected from the picture. Yeah, it's like something by someone who is ancient. That guy, oh yeah, he's like my brother. Wasn't that the story? Like the people threw some guy off the rock? Now, you would be forgiven for thinking the brother line might indicate a similarity to someone's sibling, but in fact, the young woman was confirming that yes, he is her brother. Last digression in this short talk. I'm sure I'm lying. I'm sure there's another way. Last digression in this short talk. When I was in graduate school, Professor Ted Taylor turned to me in our Shakespeare seminar and said, Ms. Skantze, next week, 15 minutes on the word like in Measure for Measure. Oh, the productive confusion and bewilderment of an inexplicable assignment. Take that, aims and objectives. In any event, I laughed that day on the bus to remember my fledgling work on Shakespeare and what it would have meant if Isabella had said, yeah, he's like my brother. Of course, the memory evokes her rather masterfully, you guys are such a great audience, a rather masterfully use of the conditional if joined to the familiar if you were like him. But the last phrase in the run of phrases on the Roman bus, wasn't that the story? Like someone threw like some guy off like some rock? Brings us back to the heart of NTO's R&J. Every appearance of an actor in NTO R&J involves narration, kind of, about the story of R&J. A delicious and continual allusion to, and these are quotes, how hot they were for each other. Details deliberately vague, but also deliberately vaguely familiar. There was some party where Romeo and his friends, there was some nurse who, coming back always to lust and longing and sex. At moments, it is painfully like a discussion in a university class on Shakespeare. The lackadaisical half-memory with no specifics, the approximation of what might be going on. But in between the very funny and painful experience of hearing what could be a tape from an internal answering machine, where our voices sound diffident and uncertain about what we are describing, starts to build all sorts of ideas about theater, about memory itself, and paradoxically about tragedy. But before these strands come together, begin to come together, we are treated to the first of several repeated moments on stage of something so inexplicable, so wrong for the proceedings, so ridiculous that even writing about it makes me laugh. The prompter's box, which, as you might remember, we have been watching like a hawk, out of it emerges a person dressed in a very large chicken suit, who, mute and without purpose, stands on stage doing something vaguely sexual, vaguely menacing, for several minutes in silence while we laugh. You have to laugh, and you realize you will be watching the box for the rest of the show, not just like a hog, but like a chicken hog. Because you want it to return. It's such a simple ploy that makes us want to see the silly thing happen again, to make us want to hear the actress describe the lust R&J experience for one another. At two crucial points, and coming to the end, the trash and treasure of NTO's production converge. In one, Robert Johansen, the male actor, begins feverishly to talk about 9/11, the American shorthand for the events of 11 September as they are referred to in Europe. He sinks rhetorical teeth into the way we could get into talking about that, because it was real, because it was happening here, because in some sense it was finally not a trumped up version of a relatively minor event, but a catastrophe. The US audience with whom I saw the play became audibly discomfited, and I became really interested in the question of tragedy now. Just that small turn in the midst of a kind of striving to tell a story without the tools of precise memory, the lines of the play, for example, made for a reverberating notion of small sadnesses set against overwhelming loss. I cannot help but think that in Berlin this moment would have been much cooler in reception, because many Europeans I have talked to felt compassion on 11 September, but they also went to the street to stop the war, a war whose consequences are today everywhere clear in the news from Iraq. So the perceived media event of how could this happen to us very much came up against the welcome to having a war on your own soil, children, national exchange. The second trash and treasure moment happens at the end. For the first part, the two actors alternate on stage as they try and recall and demonstrate the story of R&J with the help of a wordless chicken. In the second, they are on stage together speaking of acting and intermixing questions of practice and pretend with the failure of memory and the fear of theatricality that is anti-intellectual, over-assessed school culture. Take that, Mr. Gov. At the end, the audience applauds. The two come back again for another cue. The work ends and the stage goes black. From the dark, words begin. Soft, what light through yonder window breaks. The lines are exchanged in the dark. The sounds still an audience who had begun to gather their belongings. Slowly, everyone quiets down and listens. Like every bit of this production, the moment teeters on a very thin ledge, maybe the same one they were teetering on. Because it could just be, aren't Shakespeare's words swell, and really we believe in faithful renditions coda. Indeed, in his forthcoming chapter on NTO R&J, Bill Worthen suggests at this moment that, quote, here Shakespeare speaks directly to us out of the darkness, in our own idiom, unmarked by troublesome bodies, their movements and gestures, the actor's failing memory and staging rhetoric. His evocation marks with melancholy, Worthen's evocation marks with melancholy this moment as we return to the word. But for me, thinking in terms of the practice of spectating, in contrast to Worthen's use of the term passive, coupled with audience as consumers of performance, the sound of those voices are not just any voices. They are not disembodied. And one big difference between Worthen's and my experience is that when I saw the production, the voices came out of the dark and not out of a speaker. And at that moment, I am a spectator shot full of the receptive memory of those two bodies who have physically exaggerated their faces, their manners, who have linguistically trod upon beauty and delicate kissing palms with who knows what on their hands that have been spanking the tank, as one memorable line from the production has it. So I supply the corporeal power, and the voices sound to me once again on a register of comprehension of humor and tragedy, the scale of the human in breadth, in volume, but also in invention. So what happened in Berlin in the dark for non-native speakers? I recall a moment which I described in my recent book, Itinerant Spectator, when Christoph Marteller's company from Zurich brought Twelfth Night in German to Rome. The standard subtitles of the Italian translation, small digression on Nua's line, is that what's also interesting is when you're watching something where they're using a traditional translation of Shakespeare as the surtitles, while you know that what's going on is more contemporary. However, I recall my momentary confusion when applause occurred in the performance as an otherwise minor figure came forward to the end of the stage to speak. While he spoke, the surtitle box remained blank. The third time he did this in the course of the play, it occurred to me that he was speaking a sonnet. Not because I had understood the words, not because I had read the program, simply because the rhythm of the language and the fact that this was Shakespeare sent me searching for the clue to identify these mysterious but metrical pieces of monologue. I have no doubt that the sensation of an oral recognition prior to deduction came about because of the lyricism, the sound of this particular German translation of the sonnets by the poet Paul Celan. Whatever the spectator heard in the dark in Berlin through a sound system, and perhaps there were surtitles offering a traditional German translation of Shakespeare, the voices would have told the audience they were speaking a dialogue structured to play across questions, across erotic lines, across the idea of being in love and its silly sweetness before its doomed end. The surety sounding different than approximation. Not, like Romeo, like where are you? Mobile phone conversation. But the surety, at least in my reception, not reiterating texts or words as Worthen suggests, but satisfying memory, meeting the approximations and dancing with them, in performance more precious for the forgetting and the not knowing, and yet not precious at all, but of use for the moment, in the moment we hear them.